Hello there, literary thrill seekers, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Old Man Reads Poetry. I'm your host, the aforementioned Old Man. Since I will be posting this video in November, I wanted to offer you something which is appropriate to the autumn season. To Autumn by John Keats naturally came to mind, as did Autumn Song by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But in the end, I decided to go with an old favorite of mine, Spring and Fall, subtitled To a Young Child, by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Here it is. Spring and Fall. Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove on leaving? Leaves, like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh, though worlds of wan wood leaf meal lie, and yet you will weep, and know why. Now, no matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same. Nor mouth had known nor mind expressed what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is the blight man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. Gerard Manley Hopkins was born at Stratford, Essex, near London, in 1844, into a deeply religious and highly artistic family. His father was in the maritime insurance business, but was also a published poet. Both he and Hopkins' mother were devout high church Anglicans. Gerard showed early promise as both a poet and a sketch artist. Religion and the arts, especially literary arts, were the two chief themes running throughout his life. A love and appreciation of nature, more like that of the Romantic period than the Victorian one to which he actually belonged, was a slightly minor theme, but still an important one, which frequently appeared in his poems, and which is at least hinted at in the poem I just read you. In 1866, at the age of 22, he left the Church of England and converted to Catholicism, at a time when the theological differences between the two churches were taken very seriously, and profound tensions existed between their members. This caused him to become almost estranged from his beloved family. In 1868, he joined the Society of Jesus, that is, the Jesuits, and after completing his initial training, spent the rest of his life as a Jesuit priest. He always considered his duties as a priest to be more important than his poetry, which at least partly explains his relatively limited output as a poet, although dying in 1889 at the relatively young age of 45 was obviously also a factor. Today, Hopkins is considered to be one of the greatest of the Victorian poets. His style is highly creative and original to the point of being unique, but this uniqueness, which is so admired by modern readers and critics, was seen in his own time as merely being different in a troublesome way, and resulted in a general lack of acceptance for his poems, the best of which were not published until 1919, almost 3 full decades after his death. Today's poem, Spring and Fall, is a good illustration of his uniqueness of style. The unusual meter of his poems, which made use of a system he called sprung rhythm, is probably less troubling to today's readers who have been exposed to free verse than it was to those in Victorian times who were used to more classic, strictly regulated meters like iambic pentameter. But we can still sometimes be a bit puzzled by his unconventional grammar, use of words in uncommon ways, and his willingness to invent new words when the existing dictionary didn't hold any he considered satisfactory to express a particular thought. I find that reading Gerard Manley Hopkins is a bit like trying to understand, well, not a foreign language. Hopkins is definitely speaking English, but a dialect from somewhere you don't live. What I mean by that is this. If you are a native-born American, you speak English as your native language, and so do all other Americans. But I'm sure you've noticed that the English spoken, say, in California is not exactly the same as that spoken in Massachusetts, which is not exactly the same as that spoken in Georgia or Minnesota. They all differ in pace, rhythm, the pronunciation of vowels, and even, to some extent, vocabulary. Likewise, in Britain, the English spoken by London Cockneys is not exactly the same as that spoken in Liverpool or York, much less that spoken in Wales or Ireland. And in Scotland, you can sometimes listen to the Scots for quite a long time before you realize they're speaking English at all. But if you're patient, the ear becomes attuned to all these dialects, or accents if you prefer, and the meaning becomes more or less clear. Something similar is true of Hopkins' poetry. It is, you might say, as if he has created his own personal dialect for his poems. As a result, he can be pretty hard to decipher at first glance. But if you're patient and keep reading him, your ear, figuratively speaking, will become attuned, and you will begin not only to understand him, but to appreciate the logic and beauty of his unique way of expressing himself. However, the fact is that Hopkins is not yet as well known as he deserves to be, and it is quite likely that you are not yet attuned to his poetic dialect. I'm going to assume that this is the case. So I will now revisit this poem with the goal of helping you to understand its meaning. It is really a simple story he's telling here, and once you grasp what he is doing with his words, I'm sure you won't have any trouble understanding the message. This poem, Spring and Fall, is a response to an incident the poet has observed. A young child named Margaret is sad and probably crying. She is sad because she sees the leaves falling from trees she knows and cares about, causing the group of trees she knows as Golden Grove to appear to be dead or dying. He responds with a rhetorical question. Are you grieving because your beloved trees are unleaving? Unleaving is a very uncommon word, but one whose meaning here is relatively obvious. He goes on to ask her whether she, with her fresh thoughts, can care as much about leaves as she does about the things of man. That is, human relationships and human endeavors, the things we would expect her to care about, because that is what we as adults would more likely care about. The phrase fresh thoughts is meant to suggest a state of innocence and lack of worldly experience, and it is this which allows her to care as much about the trees and their leaves as she does about more adult concerns. But of course, she will grow up to become an adult. As the heart grows older, and when she does, she will probably see things the way other adults do. It will come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh. The whirls of wan wood leaf meal lie. In other words, you will encounter things much sadder than falling leaves, but you will have become so accustomed to seeing sad things that they won't even provoke an emotional response. By the way, if the words wan wood and leaf meal seem unfamiliar, it is not surprising. I do not find either one of them in any of the dictionaries in my library, and I believe Hopkins invented them for this poem. We must, therefore, infer what they mean based on the fact that they are both compounded from other common words and from their context. To me, wan wood suggests dead or sickly wood, that is, trees, and leaf meal suggests, by analogy with bone meal or corn meal, the grainy layer of rough particles which dead leaves eventually become, especially if they're walked upon. Of course, by analogy with piecemeal, leaf meal could also mean something like leaf by leaf. Perhaps both meanings are meant to be suggested, and in fact that would not surprise me. In any case, this is a typical example of Hopkins' creative ability to think outside the box linguistically. And then, having just predicted that she will be unmoved by such sights colder, he then tells her that she will experience things to cry about, and yet you will weep and know why. Not only will she weep, she will know why. In other words, she will grieve in a more self-aware and insightful way. She will understand the true source of her sorrow, which the poet is about to explain. And what is that true source? Well, to begin with, Hopkins tells us there is only one source for all our sorrows. Sorrow's springs are the same. And even though Margaret may not be able to explain it or intellectually comprehend it, somehow she intuitively knows it. Nor mouth had, no, nor mind expressed, what heart heard of, ghost guessed. By the way, Hopkins is here using ghost in the same sense Charles Dickens used it in A Christmas Carol. It means spirit, a meaning which only survives today in the expression the Holy Ghost. But ghost is by far the better word to use here, since it contributes to the wonderful use of alliteration which helps make this poem such a pleasure to read. What heart heard of, ghost guessed. The poem is full of this kind of ear-pleasing wordplay. By the way, you may have noticed that this poem looks a lot like a sonnet, although it has one line too many. And like a sonnet, the payoff comes in the final couplet. Here, Hopkins finally reveals what he's been hinting at, the one true source of all human sorrow. It is the blight man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. Remember, Hopkins was a Jesuit priest for most of his adult life. He was a well-educated and committed Christian, and as such he was profoundly aware of the Christian belief that this world is under a curse, the curse of sin. In Christian theology, all the world's problems and pains, including death itself, are a result of the original sin of man rejecting God. Because this affects the entire world and everything in it, no one can escape it. That is why it is the blight man was born for. Not only as a theological concept, but also on a personal level, Hopkins felt that his own life was blighted. Some of his poems, especially his later ones, express a deep sense of frustration, disappointment, and even something close to despair. I have seen commentaries which suggest that "It is Margaret you mourn for" refers to the fact that Margaret, like all humans, is mortal, and the older she gets, the more she will be aware of the fact that, like the leaves, she will someday die. But Hopkins understood that she had much more to mourn for than that. All of us, Margaret included, will experience many occasions of loss in our lives. We will have failures, disappointments, and injuries of many kinds. The season we call autumn can feel a bit like the dying of summer, and in that way can be seen as a reminder of our mortality. That is expressed in this poem by Hopkins, and also in the Rossetti poem, Autumn Song. What this poem has that the Rossetti poem does not is the contrast between spring and fall. By opening his poem with a reference to a young girl, I find that Hopkins makes the impending autumn, a symbol of the end of things, all the more poignant. This young child, so full of promise and possibilities, will not only eventually end in death, but will also experience pain and sorrow along the way. This thought, so well expressed by Hopkins, always produces a strong emotional reaction in me whenever I reread or recite, for I have in fact committed it to memory, this poem. By the way, I would like to point out that although the words fall and autumn are synonyms and easily interchangeable, there is this difference. Fall is the word more commonly used in America, while autumn is more common in Britain. Note that Rossetti titled his poem on the subject Autumn Song, and Keats called his To Autumn. So why did Hopkins, a British poet, use fall in the title of this one? The original sin which led to the previously mentioned curse on this world is an event known to Christian theologians as the fall of man. I believe Hopkins chose to use fall rather than autumn to remind us of this. Now, perhaps you will argue that I'm making a mountain out of a molehill by seeing such a significant meaning in such a relatively trivial choice between two essentially identical words. But I don't think so. Hopkins was very aware of not only the explicit meaning, but also the more obscure connotations of every word he used in his poems, and he was a deeply theological thinker. The title he gave this poem was no accident, I assure you. In fact, I believe a reasonable argument could be made that the real subject of this poem is the fall of man. What's more, I think that it would not have been inappropriate to entitle this poem Spring and the Fall. I wouldn't be surprised to learn, in fact, that Hopkins had actually considered this, though of course we'll never know that for certain. Of course, that is just my opinion. As is, I should add, everything I've just said about this poem. I don't claim to be an expert on the poem or on Gerard Manley Hopkins. I am just a lover of his poetry, and yet I haven't even read all his poems. Even of the poems I have read many times, this one is the only one I have memorized. So please, don't accept anything I have said here as revealed truth. I'm just sharing with you what I know and believe about him and his poetry, and I hope it will inspire you to discover Hopkins for yourself. Now, one more thing about this poem. I think it begs the question, who was Margaret? Certainly, she was not Hopkins' own child, since Hopkins was a Catholic priest and unmarried all his life. Of course, as a working priest, he would have known many children, particularly the children of Catholic families in his own parish. But before we can even hope to identify her, we have to ask if she was even a real child. I think a number of things in the poem suggest that she was real, and that the supposed incident Hopkins is responding to actually happened. First, there is the subtitle of the poem, To a Young Child. This subtitle sounds very much like a dedication. Why have it at all if no real child was involved? Most of Hopkins' poems have no subtitles. And why give her a name? Naming her Margaret makes her seem very real. Finally, and most convincingly to me, there's this. The supposed incident of Hopkins seeing her crying over falling leaves seems so unlikely that, paradoxically, it almost has to be true. Have you ever seen a child crying because the leaves were falling in the autumn of the year? Or even heard of such a thing? Neither have I. That's why I feel it's so unlikely that Hopkins would have made this up out of thin air. This incident must have really occurred, and hence there must have been a real Margaret. Although, of course, Hopkins might have changed the name to protect her privacy. Well, guess what? In a letter to his friend, Robert Bridges, he stated that this poem was, quote, not founded on any real incident, unquote. For the reasons I've already stated, I am just a wee bit skeptical of this claim, but lacking any real hard evidence to the contrary, I suppose we must take his disclaimer at face value. And who was Robert Bridges, you may well ask? Well, he was a physician turned poet who served as Poet Laureate of the United Kingdom from 1913 to 1930. But perhaps his greatest contribution to English language literature was that he arranged for the posthumous publication of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry in 1919, nearly 30 years after Hopkins' death. Without this action by Bridges, we might never have known of the great poetic genius of Gerard Manley Hopkins. If you have enjoyed my reading of his poem, please give me a thumbs up to show you liked it. Feel free to tell me in the comments section below what you did or did not like about my reading. And if there's another poem you would like to hear me read, please request it. I intend to read many more poems, both the well-known and the more obscure, on this channel. By subscribing, you can be sure not to miss any of my readings, which will be automatically provided to you when they are released. Well, that's all for now. Until next time, thanks for watching.